Good morning. Pastor Tom is actually away at his son's wedding this weekend, so let's remember to be praying for him as he enjoys a couple days of relaxation as well. You know, Kevin Carter was a South African photographer who's probably best known for his powerful documenting of many of Africa's most volatile political situations. He was born in 1960, interestingly enough, the year that Nelson Mandela's African National Conference was outlawed in Africa. He started out his career as a photographer, actually being a sports photographer, but in 1983 he soon moved to many of the front lines of Africans' most crumbling communities. Kevin was known for recording images of repression and anti-apartheid protests and starvation. In fact, if you Google his name this afternoon, you'll see some extremely powerful pictures. He's probably best known for his pictures taken in Sudan during the time of the famine. And many people believe that these pictures helped the world to, for the first time, wake up and take action to the devastation that was taking place there in the early 90s. He's probably best known for this picture. And I don't know how many of you have seen this before, but this is a picture that he took in 1993. And it's a picture of an emaciated girl collapsing on her way to a feeding center. And as you can see, there's a hungry vulture waiting in the background. This picture was first published in the New York Times and then in the Johannesburg Weekly. And very quickly, it swept the world and in many ways became an icon for what was happening in Sudan. The reaction to the picture was so strong that the New York Times actually published an unusual editor's note on the fate of the girl. It said that Kevin Carter had actually chased the vulture away and helped the little girl to the feeding center. But a few months afterwards, Kevin told an interviewer that the editor's note wasn't true. After he snapped the picture, he returned to his vehicle and drove on. And about an hour later, guilt-ridden for not doing anything, he says that I sat under a tree for hours. I smoked 2 packs of cigarettes, and I just cried. Well, on May 23rd, 1994, and 14 months after capturing that picture, Carter walked down an aisle at the Columbia University Memorial Library to receive the Pulitzer Prize for his photographic work in Sudan. And 2 months after receiving the Pulitzer, Kevin Carter was found dead from carbon monoxide poisoning in Johannesburg, committing suicide at 33. His red pickup truck was parked near a small river where he used to play as a child, and a green garden hose was attached to the vehicle's exhaust pipe that funneled the fumes inside the cab. Attached beside him, underneath his knapsack, was a note that started off by saying, "I am really, really sorry," he explained. "The pain of life overrides the joy now to the point where joy no longer exists for me." Time magazine wrote that the suicide note left behind was a litany of nightmares and dark visions, of a clutching attempt at an autobiography, self-analysis, explanation, and excuses. Another part of the note said, "I'm haunted by the vivid memories of the killings and the corpses and anger and the pain of starving or wounded children, of trigger-happy madmen, and of killer executioners." His father made a comment at Kevin's funeral, and he said, "Kevin always carried around with him the horror of the work that he did." You know, staring injustice in the face has a way of changing us and breaking us. Injustice can be a hard thing to look at. Recently, I heard an interview with Rick Warren where he said justice is an issue that few of Christ's followers, especially here in the West, take the time to truly wrestle with. And I wonder if that's true. This morning, I want us to begin the process of wrestling with this issue, not just in an intellectual way, but in a personal, soul-searching way. Specifically this morning, I want us to look at the book of Isaiah, chapter 58, verses 1 to 10, which you can find on page 526 of the Pew Bible in front of you. Allow me to read the first few verses. Isaiah says, "Shout it aloud and do not hold back. Raise your voice like a trumpet. Declare to my people their rebellion and to the house of Jacob their sins. For the day after they seek me out, they seem eager to know my ways, as if they were a nation that does what is right and has not forsaken the commands of its God. They ask me for just decisions and seem eager for God to come near them." You know, it's in these opening words of this passage that we're being reminded that the primary purpose of the prophets wasn't to foresee the future, but in fact it was to call God's people to repentance and to remind them what it means to live lives that are in keeping with their covenant. "Shout it out, don't hold back, raise your voice like a trumpet, and announce to my people that they have been rebellious." These words probably wouldn't have been a surprise to the nation of Israel, but what their sins were, their rebellions and sins, are probably what would have caught them off guard. It's important to note here that God's not displeased with some rebellious bad behavior, but rather it is with what they were obviously considering their very good behavior that was warranting this rebuke from God. Isaiah pins down their problem and lets them know that it's these very actions, the shape and form of their so-called faith, that were revealing just how far from God they had wandered. They're saying, "Look at our humble fasting, yet Yahweh still does not notice us." In verse 3, we read, "Why have we fasted, they say, and you have not seen it? Why have we humbled ourselves, and you have not noticed? Yet on the day of your fasting, you do as you please, and you exploit your workers." What was happening here is that the Hebrew people were caught actually worshiping worship. They had recently reestablished this temple worship in Jerusalem, and it had become their single-minded focus. This public practice of piety and this repeated ritualized fasting was actually starting to define their religious life. They were convinced that these acts of fasting were proving their faithfulness to God. And they were more than a bit peeved that despite all of their ritualized public displays, that God had not seen fit to answer their prayers. The people felt that God had turned a deaf ear to their problems. And the louder they seemed to shout to the Lord, it seemed that the voice of God became harder and harder for them to hear. In these verses, the prophet is telling them that even as they are worshiping, their intent is really only intended to serve their own interests. He says that their attention to fasting causes you to oppress all of your workers. Verse 4 and 5 reads, "Your fasting ends in quarreling and strife, and in striking each other with wicked fists. You cannot fast as you do today and expect your voice to be heard on high. Is this the kind of fast that I have chosen? Only a day for a man to humble himself? Is it only for bowing one's head like a reed or lying on sackcloth and ashes? Is that what you call a fast? A day acceptable to the Lord?" Instead of being a humble practice, this fasting had literally become a very public, even a showy drama that was played out for the peers. A bowed head like a bulrush, lying in sackcloth and ashes, had become little more than props that were being used for these public exhibitions. These verses tell us that this competitive fasting had led to nothing but quarreling and fighting. Isaiah asks a rhetorical question: if this self-serving, self-centered, strife-inducing behavior is really what they believe makes a day acceptable to the Lord? In verses 6 to 10, Isaiah challenges the people with a new definition of a fast. and a new understanding of what kind of rituals and activities God requires of his people. He's saying that at the heart of all of Yahweh's demands is nothing less than establishing genuine justice and mercy and compassion for everyone. Verse 6 starts out, it says, "Is not this the kind of fasting that I have chosen, to loosen the chains of injustice, to untie the cords of the yoke, to set the oppressed free, and to break every yoke? Is it not to share your food with the hungry and to provide the poor wanderer with shelter? When you see the naked, to clothe him and not to turn away from your own flesh and blood? Then your light will break forth like the dawn, and your healing will quickly appear. And then your righteousness will go before you, and the glory of the Lord will be your rear guard. Then you will call, and the Lord will answer. You will cry for help, and he will say, 'Here I am.' If you do away with the yoke of oppression, with the pointing of a finger and malicious talk, and if you spend yourselves on behalf of the hungry and satisfy the needs of the oppressed, then your light will rise in the darkness, and your night will become like noonday." Isaiah is reminding God's people that their behavior, a life that Yahweh requires, is one where everyone who truly wants to serve him lives a life of loosening the bonds of injustice, of letting the oppressed go free, sharing your bread with the hungry, and bringing the homeless poor to your house. You know, one especially telling requirement that was voiced by Isaiah is that we are not to hide ourselves from your own flesh and blood. An interesting passage. See, what had happened back then was what, in the aftermath of the economic hardships that they had been through, when extended family members had lost everything, their homes, their lands, their livelihood, and even their freedom, cutting ties with those who were no longer able to care for themselves had become commonplace. In no uncertain terms here, Isaiah was condemning this save yourself first type of mentality. In fact, he says that these acts of compassionate justice are in fact true worship. Isaiah is reminding the people that sitting in the temple and solemnly fasting is not worship when it is accomplished at the expense of or with disregard for other people's needs. The worship the Lord requires, he says, is the active incarnation of God's justice in the world. Do first, then pray. Or put another way, doing is the worship that God demands. He's saying that God's righteousness is something that needs to be experienced by the whole community and not just those who happen to be in the gated parts. Verse 10 says that if you offer your food to the hungry and satisfy the needs of the afflicted, then your light shall rise in the darkness and your gloom will be like noonday. Isaiah likes to use the Hebrew word tzedakah, which defines any charitable endeavor and usually is translated by the word charity. It is one of those rich words in Scripture, one of those rich words in the Hebrew language that just no matter how hard we try, there is no word in the English language that can describe the complexity of tzedakah. It's a very rich word that literally means righteousness and justice. You know, charity is something that we're very familiar with. We hear someone is in need and we give some money or we give gifts to help them. But charity is really the first step in giving. Tzedakah is the second step. I've always loved Jesus' statement when he says, "No greater love does a man have than he lays down his life for his friend." He's saying here that there is love and then there is greater love. There is charity and then there is tzedakah. This passage in Isaiah is calling for us as his followers, as followers of Jesus, to a higher love, a love that changes and a love beyond merely giving. There's love, and then there is greater love. There is charity, and then there is tzedakah. This passage in Isaiah is calling for us as his followers, as followers of Jesus to a higher love, a love that changes and a love beyond merely giving. There really are three different things that this passage challenges us with. And the first is that we are called to compassion. You know, when I read the words of Isaiah 58, I get the sense that God is a little frustrated with the people. He's frustrated that he has to explain what should be obvious. He has to explain this no-brainer. He has to explain this thing that he's been saying to them for hundreds and hundreds of years. Something that they've had plenty of time to absorb and understand. They just have not understood it. Well, what is this? It's the 10 Commandments. I guess it really shouldn't come as a surprise to us that they struggled to understand that, because even 700 years after Isaiah's death, someone else had to explain the 10 Commandments, and that was Jesus. We as staff have been working our way through the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5 to 7. And in many ways, it is a teaching and an explanation of the 10 Commandments. Sometimes I wonder if God shouldn't have written an 11th commandment right after do not murder, do not commit adultery, do not steal, do not bear false witness, do not covet. He maybe should have written, and don't make me have to explain myself again. I think that God might have been frustrated with the people. But the sad thing is that it had to be explained. So Isaiah in this passage names 8 things that true followers must do to keep the spirit of the commandments alive. You see, the Israelites attempted to live their lives for God, and in doing so, keeping the letter of the law. Their struggle was keeping the spirit of the law. You know what it means when he says, do not murder. He doesn't simply mean don't stick a knife in someone's chest and cause them to die. He means don't participate in all the evil leading up to such event. The anger, the jealousy, the revenge, the getting even, the rage, the hatred. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus was in many ways redefining the conditions of the law. How many times did he say, you have heard it said, but now I say to you? Remember how Jesus redefined the 6th commandment. He said, you've heard it said, do not murder, but I tell you that anyone who is angry with his brother shall be subject to judgment. Isaiah had to explain the very simple principle, do not steal. Now we know what that means, but do we apply it throughout our lives? I wonder how many times do we wear a $200 coat to warm ourselves in the winter, knowing that it was made by a lady with 6 kids who's paid $2 a day in deplorable working environments in some third world country? And do we get upset enough about it to fight these kind of injustices? You know, does Isaiah really call that stealing? Well, he said, on the day of your fasting, you do as you please and exploit all your workers. Sounds like he's talking to the business owners. And it sounds like he's saying, you business owners are stealing from your employees. Workers are to be treated with dignity and paid well for their work. If you don't pay your workers a fair wage and create reasonable working environments, you in fact are stealing from them. Compassion is allowing God to write the law upon our hearts and not just our heads. So we are called to compassion. The second thing is that we are called to action. This passage in Isaiah calls us to be active. Isaiah challenged those worshipers in the temple to get off their knees and onto their feet. You know, he says God doesn't need your empty praise. God is not honored when they lie about in sackcloth and ashes. What honors Yahweh is for them to be actively helping those whose most basic human needs are not being met. I want you to know this morning that I am extremely proud to be a part of Grant. You know, we give to the community and we give to our world, and we help the poor throughout our community and the world with our weekly offerings and in many other different ways. We are a very charitable church. And with God's help, I pray that we will never grow tired of that kind of giving. But let me add that charity is never a substitute for justice. Charity gives, but justice changes. It changes the lives of the poor for the good and for good. Justice is what sends a young girl to school who can't afford it. Justice lends, expecting nothing in return. Justice doesn't just give charity, but it provides hope. Like we are doing through our Run for AIDS. It enables people to do more than simply provide a meal, but it helps Beacon of Hope in Kenya to build relationships with people and help them to get out of their cycle of poverty. It helps to provide people with permanent solutions. We're doing this through City Church, where City Church is enabling people who are displaced and have come from other countries as immigrants and refugees. We are helping them to begin to build their lives here in Canada. We're doing this by helping a couple here who want to go and share their faith with an unreached people group, the Uyghur people in China. We're doing this through supporting a work that trains leaders in Bangladesh. And that list could go on and on. Where charity at times provides a much-needed Band-Aid, justice provides hope for the future. Charity gives, but justice changes. It demands the changes necessary for the lives of the poor to be elevated to a level playing field with everybody else. You know, one of the things that I love about this passage in Isaiah is really redefining the word fast and the kind of fast that the Lord requires. Is it to share your bread with the hungry and bring the homeless poor into your house? When you see the naked, to cover them and not to hide yourself from your own kin, as it says. This kind of righteousness, or tzedakah, defines a true understanding of biblical justice. So we are called to compassion, we are called to action, but we're also called to community. We're called to we rather than I. And when I say we, I'm spelling that W-I-I, and some of you know what I mean by that, not W-E, and let me explain that in a minute. We are called to community. I wonder sometimes if we don't need a major paradigm shift in how charitable ministries are thought through. You know, many ministries major on principles and minor on relationships. I was talking with the head of a rescue mission a few weeks ago, and he made this interesting comment to me. He said, our biggest problem with Christians is that all they want to do is take stands for the poor and come here and visit the poor and view the poor and to hand out food to the poor. But few are coming here truly wanting a relationship with the poor. I think an unlikely model for this kind of shift might be the console by Nintendo called the Wii. And yes, that is spelled W-I-I, but pronounced Wii. You know, up until recently, gaming was something done almost exclusively in isolation. Maybe one would play or two would play it the most. But the Wii seems to have changed that. You can now find Nintendo Wiis in nursing homes and in the center of a lot of family rooms. Why? Because Nintendo changed the joystick and made it work like the real world works. You know, my family and I have a Wii, and when we play the bowling game, which can be done with multiple people, we actually go through the same actions a bowler would go through. Same with tennis and golf and several other games. Suddenly, everyone can understand the video game because everybody understands how to bowl, how to swing a racket and other things, how to swing a golf club. The video game is no longer a bunch of buttons, but it works like real life works. Let me tell you that is real justice, because this father can finally beat his son at a video game. You know, the Wii has leveled the playing field between modern kids and out-of-date dads, and I'm very thankful for that. But here's my point. Charity requires that I give, where justice requires that I change the game so that I no longer have to give, so that the poor can play the game the same as me, so that they can live, move, and have their being in the same community as all of us. You'll remember the young man who was rich and religious and came to Jesus wanting to be saved. And Jesus told the man, follow the law. The man said, I have done this all of my life, he said. One thing you lack, Jesus said, sell what you have and give it to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven. And then come and follow me. Jesus required that the man give, but he also required that he change his life's orientation. What must I do? That was his question. But Jesus said, let me tell you what God is doing. Come follow me, and we will do it together. Then you will know what salvation is, and then you will have true treasure in heaven. I know that sometimes it's hard to grasp how huge many of the global injustice issues are. But let's try something. Let's picture that the entire world is our village, and our village is made up of 100 people. Our village looks something like this. The village would have 60 Asians, 14 Africans, 12 Europeans, 8 Latin Americans, 5 from the US and Canada, and 1 from the South Pacific. 80 of those people would live in substandard housing. 67% would be unable to read. 50 would be malnourished. 33 would be without access to a safe water supply. 33 would be living on only 3% of the income of the village. 5 of those individuals would control 32% of the entire wealth. Only 1 would have a university or college education. 1 would have AIDS, and 1 would be dying of starvation. Those last 2 hit me the hardest because 1 has AIDS and 1 is dying because of stupid poverty. And in a world, when I say stupid poverty, what I mean is that in a world that provides 2.5 times the food that it can actually consume, there's no excuse for people going hungry. If the world were just 100 people, I know that you and I would do whatever we could for the one who was starving and the one dealing with AIDS. So maybe my question this morning is, what can you do and what can we do? And with God's help, that answer is endless. It's my prayer that in the weeks and months ahead, that God would help each of us to answer that question, and that Tzedakah would become a way of life for each of us. You know, justice can be found in simple decisions that we make throughout the day, from what kind of coffee you buy to what type of clothing you buy. My prayer is that God would not just create in us a sensitive heart, but we would be called to compassion and justice. May each of us truly wrestle with our own response to God's justice. Let's pray. Father, it's very easy to get overwhelmed as we look at the world, as we look at so many of the issues that so many of our brothers and sisters around the world are dealing with. And it's very difficult, Lord, even in a morning like this, to be able to talk about it and feel like we can walk away with some constructive things that we can do. But Lord, it's my prayer that you would, through your Spirit, be creating in all of us a sensitivity to the kind of justice that you want your followers to be bringing to the world. May we not just have that sensitivity, Lord, but as you call us to different things, may we be obedient in responding to that calling.